In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, where life was worth less than a canteen of water and trust was a fool's currency, a single act of kindness can echo through generations. This is the story of Josiah Blackwell, a prospector with nothing but a dream and a young, desperate Apache warrior on the brink of death. It's a story of a gamble, a choice between fear and humanity made during a blinding blizzard. But that one night would forge a silent, invisible bond, a debt of honor that would lie dormant for 20 years, only to be repaid when all hope was lost and a son's life hung by a thread. The wind howled like a legion of banshees, clawing at the walls of Josiah Blackwell's cabin. It wasn't just wind. It was a physical force carrying with it a blinding payload of snow and ice that scoured the high desert landscape of the Superstition Mountains. For 3 days, the world outside had been a churning vortex of white. Josiah, a man of 30 years, whose face was already beginning to be mapped by the sun, and hardship fed another piece of gnarled mesquite into the pot-bellied stove. The small cabin nestled in a protective crook of a nameless canyon was his entire world, a 15 by 15-foot fortress against the raw, untamed wilderness of the Arizona Territory. He had built it himself, log by painstaking log, after his dreams of striking the lost Dutchman's gold had faded from a roaring fire to a stubborn ember. Now he mostly trapped and hunted, selling pelts in the small rough-and-tumble settlement of Pinal Creek when the weather allowed. It was a lonely existence, made all the more so by the fresh grave on the rise behind the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross. Eleanor, his wife, taken by a fever the previous spring. Her laughter still echoed in the rafters on quiet nights, a phantom warmth against the chill of his solitude. It was her memory that made him hesitate. It was her voice he heard in his mind when the pounding came at the door, a sound distinct from the gale's chaotic assault. It was measured, desperate. Josiah's hand went instantly to the 1860 Colt Army revolver, holstered on his hip. His heart hammered against his ribs. No sane man was out in this, which meant whoever was at his door wasn't sane, or they were in a kind of trouble that defied reason. In this land, trouble usually came wearing moccasins and a fearsome scowl. The Apache, Chiricahua most likely. Stories of their raids were the boogeyman tales of the territory, whispered in saloons and around campfires. They were ghosts of the desert, merciless and cunning. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice rough from disuse. Only the wind answered, but the pounding came again, weaker this time. A scraping sound as if a body was slumping against the thick wood. Fear was a cold, coiling snake in his gut. "Leave it be, Josiah. You're alone. One man. Don't you invite the devil in." But then another voice, Eleanor's. "There's a difference between caution and cruelty, Josiah. Every soul deserves a chance at mercy." He took a deep breath, drew the heavy iron bar from across the door, and cracked it open a few inches. The Colt leveled steady in his hand. The wind tore the opening wider, revealing a figure collapsed on his doorstep. It wasn't a war party. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 winters old. He was Apache, no doubt, with high cheekbones, long black hair matted with snow, and skin the color of burnished copper. But there was no fight in him. His tunic was torn. His deerskin leggings offered little protection from the blizzard, and his eyes, when they flickered open, were glazed with the lethargy that precedes freezing to death. He held no weapon, only a profound and chilling vulnerability. For a long moment Josiah stood there, the gun a heavy, cold weight in his hand, a war raging within him. This was the enemy, the spectre that haunted every lone prospector, every isolated rancher. He had seen the aftermath of a raid once, a smouldering wagon, bodies bristling with arrows. The memory was seared into his brain. But looking at the boy, shivering uncontrollably, his lips blue and cracked, Josiah didn't see a warrior. He saw a child at the mercy of the same brutal wilderness that had taken his Eleanor. He saw a human being. With a curse that was half prayer, he lowered the pistol, holstered it, and dragged the boy inside. The warmth of the cabin hit the young Apache like a physical blow. He gasped, his body racked with a violent tremor. Josiah laid him on the bearskin rug before the stove, the warmest spot in the house. He worked quickly, his trapper's instincts taking over. He stripped off the boy's frozen, wet clothes, ignoring the lean, wiry strength of the body beneath the old scars that told of a hard life. He wrapped him in a thick wool blanket, chafing his hands and feet to restore circulation. For the next hour, they existed in a world without language. There were only actions. Josiah brewed a strong, bitter coffee and spooned some of the hot liquid laced with a little sugar between the boy's lips. He ladled out a bowl of the venison stew that had been simmering on the stove all day. The Apache youth ate slowly at first, then with a ravenous hunger that spoke of days without food. He never took his eyes off Josiah. They were dark, intelligent eyes, filled with a cautious, watchful intensity. There was no gratitude in them, not yet. There was suspicion, confusion, and a core of pride that even the threat of death could not extinguish. Josiah understood. Kindness from a white man was more foreign and potentially more dangerous than the blizzard. When the boy was done, he simply sat wrapped in the blanket, staring into the flames of the stove. The silence in the cabin was thick, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the unending scream of the wind. Josiah sat in his chair across the room, cleaning his rifle, the familiar mechanical task a comfort. He didn't turn his back on the boy, but he didn't stare him down either. He simply occupied the same space, a silent truce declared against the common enemy outside. He wondered about the boy's story. Was he a scout, separated from his party? An exile, a survivor of some unknown calamity? The questions hung in the air unanswered. The boy's name, he learned later from a trader, was likely something like Desoda He, which meant he just sits there in the Chiricahua tongue, a name perhaps given for his quiet, observant nature. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. During that time, the strange cohabitation continued. They shared meals in silence. Josiah would point to the stew, the boy would nod. The boy watched Josiah mend a trap, his eyes following every intricate twist of the wire. Josiah watched the boy take a small piece of flint from a pouch he'd managed to keep dry and meticulously sharpen a small knife. He carried the focus in his eyes absolute. They were 2 men from worlds that were at war. Yet in the crucible of that tiny cabin, they were simply 2 souls surviving. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The silence was as stunning as the noise had been. Josiah opened the door to a transformed world. The sun was brilliant, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The snow lay in immense sculpted drifts, sparkling as if seeded with millions of diamonds. The air was so cold and clean, it hurt to breathe. The Apache boy stood beside him, looking out at the landscape. He was dressed in his own, now dry clothes. He looked stronger, his movements fluid and sure once more. He looked at the sun, then at the mountains to the south, his internal compass already recalibrated. He turned to Josiah. For a moment, their eyes met. The boy's gaze was still intense, but the suspicion was gone, replaced by something Josiah couldn't quite decipher. It was a look of profound acknowledgement, a weighing and measuring of the act that had been done. Then the boy reached into a small pouch at his belt. He pulled out a single exquisitely crafted arrowhead. It was not flint or chert, but a piece of polished black obsidian, its edges lethally sharp. It was a thing of beauty and function, a tool of both life and death. He held it out to Josiah on his open palm. Josiah knew this was more than a trinket. It was a payment, a symbol. In a world where there was no common currency and no shared language, this was a contract, a declaration. I owe you. Josiah took the arrowhead. It was cool and smooth in his palm. He nodded slowly. Go with God, he whispered, knowing the words were meaningless to the boy, but the sentiment was universal. The Apache youth gave a single, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then, without a backward glance, he strode out into the blinding snow, moving with a tireless, ground-eating gait. Within minutes he was a small, dark speck against the vast whiteness, and then he was gone, swallowed by the wilderness, as if he had never been there at all. Josiah stood in the doorway for a long time, the obsidian arrowhead clutched in his hand. He closed the door, the cabin suddenly feeling emptier than it had in 3 days. He went to the small wooden box where he kept his few treasures. Eleanor's locket, his father's pocket watch, and placed the arrowhead inside. It was an odd keepsake, a memento of a silent enemy who had slept by his fire. He didn't know why, but he felt that keeping it was important. He felt somehow that the story wasn't over. He had no idea just how right he was. 20 years. In the vast, patient timeline of the desert, it was the blink of an eye. For a man, it was a lifetime. The Arizona Territory of 1883 was a different beast. The railroad had sliced through the wilderness, bringing with it a flood of new people, new money, and new kinds of trouble. The wars with the Apache were not over, but they had changed, becoming more desperate and brutal as the tribes were squeezed onto reservations. Towns like Phoenix and Tucson were burgeoning, and the land itself was being carved up, branded, and fought over with a ferocity that rivaled any predators. Josiah Blackwell was now 50 years old. The sun and sorrow had finished the map on his face, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His hair was more salt than pepper, but his shoulders were still broad, his hands still strong. The old cabin still stood, but it was now the heart of a small, thriving ranch. After the blizzard, he had given up prospecting for good. The close brush with both death and the humanity of his supposed enemy had changed him. He'd wanted to build something that would last, something rooted in the earth. He had married again a good woman named Sarah, and she had given him a son, Thomas. Sarah had been taken by cholera 5 years back, another cross joining Eleanor's on the hill. Now it was just him and Thomas. Thomas Blackwell was everything Josiah was not. At 18 he was tall and wiry, with a shock of sandy hair and eyes that burned with the fire of youth. He was impatient, idealistic, and saw the world in stark shades of black and white, right and wrong. He loved the ranch with a fierce possessiveness, seeing it not as a struggle for survival, but as a kingdom. Their kingdom. The Blackwell Ranch. It wasn't much of a kingdom by most standards. A few hundred head of hardy longhorns, a modest ranch house built onto the original cabin, and a barn. But it had one thing that made it more valuable than the richest gold mine water. Whispering Creek, a spring-fed stream that gurgled out of the rocks, behind the cabin ran year-round. In a land defined by thirst, that clear, cold water was life itself. It was why their cattle were fat and their small patch of garden grew. And it was why Silas Cain wanted their land. Silas Cain was a name that was either spoken with fear or reverence in the territory. He owned the sprawling Bar K Ranch, a cattle empire that surrounded the Blackwell property on 3 sides. Cain was a man who had clawed his way to the top and had left a trail of ruined men in his wake. He was tall and gaunt, with a predatory stoop and a face that earned him the moniker, the Vulture. His eyes, small and deeply set, missed nothing and coveted everything. The trouble started, as it often did, politely. Cain rode over one Sunday afternoon, flanked by 2 of his hard-faced ranch hands, his expensive silver-inlaid saddle creaking in protest under his weight. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator conserving its energy. "Blackwell," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He nodded at Thomas, who stood stiffly beside his father, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "Son." Cain Josiah replied, his tone even. "What brings you out to our corner of the world?" "Business always business," Cain said, letting his gaze sweep over the property, lingering on the green line of cottonwoods that marked the creek's path. "I'm expanding, consolidating my holdings. Your parcel here sits right in the middle of my best grazing land. It's inconvenient." "It's home to us," Josiah said flatly. Cain gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a skull. "Everything has a price, Blackwell. I'm prepared to offer you a fair one. $500. Cash," Thomas snorted. $500. For this land and the only reliable water for 10 miles. That's not a price, that's an insult. Cain's eyes narrowed, fixing on the boy. "Your son has a mouth on him, Blackwell. You should all teach him some respect. The world is a hard place for disrespectful boys." "He knows the value of his home," Josiah said, stepping slightly in front of Thomas. "And it's not for sale. Not for 500, not for 5,000. My wife is buried on that hill. My son was born in that house. You can't put a price on that." Cain's facade of civility cracked. His face hardened into a granite mask of avarice. "You're an old fool living in the past. This is the new West. It's about progress, about growth. And sentimental old men standing in the way of progress tend to get washed away." He stared hard at Josiah, a clear, unmistakable threat in his eyes. "I'm a reasonable man. I'm giving you a chance to walk away with something in your pocket. Think on it. My offer won't stand forever." He mounted his horse, wheeled it around, and rode off without another word, his men trailing behind him like pilot fish on a shark. Thomas was shaking with rage. "Washed away. He threatened you, Pa. He threatened us. We should ride into town. Tell Sheriff Brody." Josiah watched Cain disappear into a cloud of dust before turning to his son. His face was grim. "And tell him what?" "That a man made a low offer on our land. Brody is a good man, but he's one man against Cain's payroll. Cain owns half the businesses in Pinnell Creek. He has the judge in his pocket. The law won't help us here, son. Not yet. So we do nothing. We just wait for him to wash us away." "No," Josiah said, his voice low and hard. "We don't do nothing. We watch. We mend our fences. We keep our guns clean, and we don't give him an excuse. You don't fight a rattler by screaming at its son. You watch it, and you wait for your moment. Josiah walked back into the house, his shoulders heavy with a familiar weight. He knew this fight was coming. He had seen Cain's type before. Men who saw the world as a platter from which they could take whatever they wanted. Men for whom honor was a weakness and greed was a virtue. Later that night, unable to sleep, Josiah opened the old wooden box by his bedside. He took out the obsidian arrowhead. 20 years. It felt like another lifetime. He remembered the silent, starving boy, the fury of the storm, the unspoken promise in a piece of sharpened Blackwell. It was a memory from a wilder, simpler time. But as he held the cold, smooth arrowhead in his palm, he felt a strange premonition. He was standing on the edge of another storm, a man-made one, and he feared it would be far more destructive than any blizzard. Silas Cain was not a man accustomed to the word no. Josiah's refusal was not a setback. It was an affront, a challenge to his authority. And so began a campaign of slow, grinding attrition, a war of 1,000 cuts designed to break the Blackwell's spirit. It started small. A section of fence would be cut in the night, and a dozen head of their cattle would wander onto Bar K land, where they were promptly absorbed into Cain's massive herd. When Thomas rode over to demand their return, he was met with sneers and feigned ignorance from Cain's foreman, a bull-necked thug named Jebediah Jeb Rourke. Can't tell one cow from another out here. Kid Rourke had drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Thomas's boot. They all look the same to me. Maybe you should take better care of your fences. Next, their supply wagon was accidentally run off the road on its way back from Pinnell Creek. A wheel was shattered, and a month's worth of flour, salt, and coffee was lost in the dust. Josiah and Thomas spent 2 days repairing the wagon, their jaws tight with unspoken fury. The pressure was constant, a low-grade poison seeping into their lives. Bar K riders would patrol the edges of their property, their presence a silent, constant threat. They would sit on their horses on a nearby ridge, just watching their figures' dark silhouettes against the setting sun. Thomas grew more and more agitated. This is a siege, Pa. We're prisoners on our own land. We have to fight back. With what son Josiah asked patiently one evening, patching a leather harness by lamplight. We have 2 rifles. Cain has 30 hired guns. You ride over there looking for a fight, you'll find one. And you'll lose. That's what he wants. He's goading you. He wants you to make a mistake, to give him a reason to bring the law down on us. His law. So we let him choke us out, starve us out. Thomas's voice cracked with frustration. We endure, Josiah said, his voice as steady as the rock of the mountains outside. We show him we can't be broken. We show him we have more grit than he has greed. But even Josiah's formidable patience was tested when they found the well. It wasn't their main water source that was the creek, but the well near the barn was crucial for the horses and the small garden Sarah had planted. One morning the water came up cloudy and stinking. Josiah lowered a lantern into the shaft, and his face went pale. A dead coyote, bloated and rotting, had been thrown in, fouling the water completely. This was different. This was not just business. It was personal. It was a desecration. It was Cain, spitting on the memory of his wife on the very heart of their home. That was the day Thomas exploded. Before Josiah could stop him, he was saddled up his Winchester in his saddle scabbard, his face a mask of cold fury. I'm going to see the sheriff, and if he won't do anything, I'm going to see Kane." "Thomas, no!" Josiah yelled, running out after him. But Thomas spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving Josiah standing in a cloud of dust, a cold dread washing over him. The boy was walking straight into the vulture's trap. In Pinal Creek, Sheriff Brody listened to Thomas's frantic story with a weary expression. Brody was a man in his late 40s, with a drooping mustache and the exhausted eyes of someone who had seen too much and been able to do too little. "A dead coyote in your well, you say?" Brody sighed, running a hand over his balding head. "Son, I believe you. I know Kane is a hard man. But what you're giving me is suspicion, not proof. Did you see who did it? Of course not. They did it in the middle of the night. But who else would it be?" "I can't arrest a man on who else would it be," Brody said, his voice apologetic. "Silas Kane is the biggest taxpayer in this county. He's got friends in Prescott, friends in the territorial government. I go after him without an ironclad case, and it's my badge he'll have not his freedom. My hands are tied. Son, I'm sorry." Furious and disillusioned, Thomas stormed out of the sheriff's office and did the one thing his father had warned him against. He strode down the dusty main street to the saloon Kane practically owned the gilded cage. He pushed through the batwing doors and stood blinking in the smoky gloom. Silas Kane was there, sitting at a corner table playing poker with Rourke and 2 other men. He looked up as Thomas entered, a flicker of triumph in his cold eyes. He had been expecting this. "Well, well." "Look what the wind blew in," Kane rasped. "Come for a drink, boy?" "I've come for justice," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly, but loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "You're a coward and a thief, Kane. Poisoning a man's well is the lowest thing a man can do." The saloon went quiet. Men stopped their conversations, turning to watch the unfolding drama. Kane slowly placed his cards face down on the table. He stood up, his tall frame unfolding like a gallows. "Those are strong words, boy. You have proof to back them up. I have the word of my father and the stink of your corruption that hangs over this whole valley." Rourke started to get up, but Kane held up a hand, stopping him. He walked slowly toward Thomas, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet away, his vulture-like face contorted in a sneer. "Your father is a relic, a stubborn old goat who doesn't know when he's beaten. And you're just a hot-headed fool. You come into my town, into my establishment, and you accuse me. You have no idea the trouble you're in. It's you who's in trouble." Thomas shot back his hand, dropping to his pistol. It was a fatal mistake. Before his fingers could even touch the grip, Rourke had moved with surprising speed, slamming a chair into the back of Thomas's knees. As Thomas buckled another of Kane's men, drove a fist into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Kane looked down at him with utter contempt. "Get him out of here," he ordered. "Throw him in the street. Let this be a lesson. The next time any of you feel like questioning my business, remember this boy crying in the dirt." Thomas was dragged out and thrown into the dusty street like a sack of garbage. He lay there bruised, humiliated, and defeated, the laughter from the saloon ringing in his ears. The trap hadn't just been sprung. He had walked into it, armed it, and pulled the trigger on himself. And Silas Kane had seen it all. He now knew for certain that the boy was the weak link, and he knew just how to break him. The humiliation in town hardened Thomas, but it also made him reckless. A quiet, simmering rage replaced his youthful idealism. He and Josiah worked in tense silence, the unspoken "I told you so" hanging between them. They knew Cain's next move would be more direct, more final. They just didn't know what form it would take. Cain was patient. He let a month pass, lulling them into a false sense of security. The riders on the ridge disappeared. The fence cutting stopped. A fragile, unnerving peace settled over the Blackwell ranch. Josiah knew it was the quiet before the storm, the unnerving calm before a lightning strike. The plan Cain devised was diabolically simple. He wasn't just going to drive the Blackwells off their land. He was going to take it from them legally using the very law they had tried to invoke against him. He would remove the son, and in doing so, break the father. It happened on a moonless night in late autumn. Cain's foreman, Jeb Rourke, along with 3 other hands, drove about 20 Bar K steers to a remote, scrub-choked arroyo on the border of the Blackwell property. Under Cain's direct orders, they built a small, temporary corral pushing the cattle inside. Then Rourke took his knife and cut the Bar K brand on one of the steers, crudely altering it to resemble the Blackwell's simple S brand. The final piece of the trap was the most cold-blooded. One of the hired guns, a drifter named Miller, had been chosen as the sacrificial lamb. Miller was a loudmouth and a drunk, and Cain owed him back pay. In Cain's cruel calculus, he was expendable. After the brand was altered, Rourke started a loud, drunken argument with Miller. The argument ended with Rourke pulling his pistol and shooting Miller point-blank in the chest. They left Miller's body lying in the dust next to the badly altered brand. For the final touch, Rourke produced a hunting knife he had stolen from the Blackwell's barn weeks earlier. During a nightly raid, a knife with a distinctive notch in the handle that everyone knew belonged to Thomas Blackwell. He dropped it in the dirt near Miller's outstretched hand. The next morning, Rourke rode into Pinal Creek, his face a mask of feigned horror. He burst into the sheriff's office, claiming they had tracked a rustler who had been stealing their cattle. He'd found the stolen steers and poor Miller murdered in cold blood. Sheriff Brody, with Cain standing beside him looking grim and righteous, formed a posse. It was comprised almost entirely of Bar K men. They rode out to the arroyo, where the scene of the crime was exactly as Rourke had left it. It's rustling and it's murder. Cain declared, his voice booming with authority for all the posse to hear. The brand has been changed. And look here. He pointed a long, bony finger at the knife in the dust. I'd know that knife anywhere. That belongs to the Blackwell boy. Sheriff Brody picked up the knife, his face troubled. He recognized it too. It was flimsy evidence, circumstantial at best, but with a dozen of Cain's men, all nodding in agreement, the pressure was immense. The posse thundered toward the Blackwell ranch. Josiah and Thomas were mending a corral gate when they heard the approaching horses. They looked up to see a cloud of dust resolve into a dozen armed men, with the sheriff at their head. Josiah Blackwell. Thomas Blackwell. Brody yelled out, his voice strained. I have a warrant for the arrest of Thomas Blackwell for the murder of Jacob Miller. Thomas's face went white. Murder. I don't even know a Jacob Miller. What is this? We found him dead. Son. Shot. Next to a pen full of Bar K cattle, one of which had its brand cut to look like yours, Brody explained, avoiding Josiah's piercing gaze. And we found this." He held up the knife. Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. "My knife. It was stolen from the barn a month ago." "That's what they all say, kid." Rourke sneered from his horse. "It's a frame-up." "Sheriff." "A lie." Josiah roared, his composure finally breaking. "You know it is. This is Kane's doing." Silas Kane urged his horse forward, his face a picture of solemn gravity. "Sheriff, the evidence is clear. I warned this boy. He was angry. He made threats in town. Now a good man is dead. He needs to face justice." Thomas, seeing the trap closing around him, panicked. "I'm not going with you. You'll hang me for something I didn't do." He made a desperate move, turning as if to run for the house where his rifle was. It was the second fatal mistake. "He's resisting," Rourke yelled. Instantly, 3 of Kane's men spurred their horses forward, tackling Thomas and wrestling him to the ground. They bound his hands behind his back with a rough pigging string, the coarse rope cutting into his wrists. Josiah started forward, a primal roar in his throat, but the cold, round barrels of 6 rifles swung to cover him. He froze, his heart shattering into 1,000,000 pieces. He was helpless. He could only watch as they dragged his son, struggling and shouting his innocence, up onto a horse. "He'll get a fair trial, Josiah, Sheriff." Brody said, his voice hollow, refusing to meet the old man's eyes. But they both knew it was a lie. A circuit judge, friendly to Kane, was due in town in 3 days. The trial would be a formality. The gallows were already being built in Pinal Creek. Josiah Blackwell stood alone in his yard, watching the posse disappear with his only son. The silence that descended was more profound than any blizzard, more deafening than any wind. The vulture had won. He had taken everything: the ranch, the water, the future. He had taken his son. The old man sank to his knees in the dust, his face a mask of utter soul-crushing despair. He looked up at the impassive, sun-bleached sky, and for the first time in his life, Josiah Blackwell had no idea what to do. He was beaten. The high desert keeps its secrets. From the ridges of the Superstition Mountains, the world of the white man, with his fences, his noisy towns, and his strange, bitter quarrels, was a slow-moving drama observed by patient eyes. For generations the Apache had watched. They knew the patterns of the ranchers, the routes of the soldiers, the location of every spring and hidden canyon. To survive, they had become masters of intelligence ghosts in their own land. An old warrior named Goloko Owl was one such observer. He was a scout for a small, elusive band of Chiricahua who had thus far evaded the reservations, living deep within the mountain wilderness. Their leader was a man respected for his wisdom and strategic mind, a man who had seen the world change and knew that the old ways of open warfare were over. His name was Desoda Hay. From a high vantage point, hidden in a cluster of rocks and junipers, Goloko had seen the whole sordid affair unfold. He had seen Kane's men drive the cattle into the arroyo. He had seen the flash and heard the distant crack of the pistol in the dead of night. He had seen them plant the knife. And he had seen them ride to the small ranch by Whispering Creek, the ranch of the old granite-faced white man. He watched as they dragged the frantic young man away. Goloko knew injustice when he saw it. This was a white man's quarrel, and normally he would have ignored it. But he recognized the ranch. His people knew of the old man who lived there. He was not like the others. He did not hunt Apache for bounties. He did not foul their sacred places. He left them be. And there was a story an old story that their leader sometimes told on cold nights of a blizzard long ago, and a cabin that had offered shelter instead of death. The scout made his way back to their hidden camp, a journey that would take a full day on foot through terrain no horse could manage. He found Dasoda sitting by a small, smokeless fire, polishing a rifle stock. Dasoda was no longer the starving boy Josiah had saved. He was a man in his late 30s, his face lean and hard, etched with the responsibilities of leadership. His body was a road map of scars, each one a story of survival. But his eyes were the same dark, intelligent, and intensely watchful. The boy who just sat there had become a man who saw everything. Goloko recounted what he had witnessed, his words, sparse but precise. He described the staged crime, the planted knife, the capture of the young man. He described the ranch and the old man left behind. His shoulders slumped in defeat. As he spoke, Dasoda stopped his work. He listened, his expression unreadable. When Goloko finished, the camp was silent. Dasoda looked south toward the direction of the white man's town. The boy. He has hair the color of the sun-scorched grass, he asked in their native tongue. Yes, Goloko confirmed. And the old one, his face is like the canyon walls after a storm. It is. Dasoda closed his eyes for a moment. A debt. Nut ego na ilnish. A good deed must be returned. It was a principle as fundamental to the Chiricahua as the earth beneath them. A debt of honor was not a trifle to be forgotten. It was a living thing, a spiritual weight that must be balanced. The white man had saved his life, his physical life. But in doing so, he had also shown Dasoda that not all white men were the monsters of his childhood stories. That single act had planted a seed of complexity in his worldview, a seed that had grown into the cautious wisdom he now possessed. He owed the old man more than just a life. He stood up. Around his neck on a thin leather thong hung a small object. It was a piece of smooth black obsidian, sharpened to a perfect edge. He had carried it for 20 years. A reminder. Choose 5 of our best men, he said to Goloko. Those who move like shadows and make no sound. We ride tonight. Not for war, for balance. The rescue would be an act of impossible stealth. Thomas Blackwell was being held in the Pinal Creek jail, a flimsy structure of wood and iron bars awaiting the judge's arrival. 2 of Kane's men acted as guards, sitting on the porch drinking whiskey and playing cards. The hanging was scheduled for the day after tomorrow at dawn. That night, a new moon hid the sky in a blanket of ink. Dasoda and his 6 warriors, their faces painted with dark clay, moved through the desert like wraiths. They left their horses miles from town and approached on foot, using every dip in the terrain, every shadow for cover. Their plan was one of elegant misdirection. Goloko and 2 others circled to the far eastern end of the small town to the livery stable. Using a fire drill, they created a small, smoldering ember, which they placed in a pile of dry hay. Within minutes, the hay caught and flames began to lick up the side of the wooden building. A man leaving the saloon was the first to see it. Fire! The livery's on fire! The cry tore through the night. Pinal Creek. A town built of dry timber had one mortal fear, and it was fire. The saloon emptied. Men poured out of houses. The 2 guards at the jail, startled, looked at each other. "It's Silas's prize stallion in there," one yelled, and without a second thought they abandoned their post and ran toward the chaos, joining the bucket brigade that was frantically forming. In that moment of distraction, Dasoda and his remaining warriors materialized from the shadows behind the jail. They did not break the lock. They lifted the entire window frame bars, and all from the rotten wood with 2 strong pry bars, fashioned from oak branches. The sound was lost in the distant shouts and crackling flames. Thomas, lying on the cot inside, defeated heard a faint whisper. He looked up to see the window being pulled away and dark figures slipping inside. He scrambled back, his heart leaping into his throat, thinking Cain had sent men to kill him before the trial. But they didn't attack. The leader, a man with eyes that seemed to burn in the darkness, simply held up a hand for silence. He used a knife to saw through the ropes binding Thomas's wrists. He pointed to the open window. Thomas was stunned, confused. Who are you?" he whispered. Dasodahai did not speak English well enough for a conversation. Instead, he reached for the thong around his neck and pulled out the obsidian arrowhead. He held it in his palm so Thomas could see it glint in the faint, flickering light from the distant fire. He then pointed through the window first toward the mountains, then toward Thomas, and then tapped his own chest. The message was unmistakable. "I am repaying a debt to your father." He pushed a canteen and a small bag of jerky into Thomas's hands, then nudged him toward the window. Outside, a horse taken silently from the back of the saloon stood waiting. Thomas, his mind reeling, scrambled out the window. He looked back at the Apache leader, who simply nodded once, a gesture of finality. Thomas mounted the horse and, following the Apache's pointed finger, rode north away from the town, away from the gallows, melting into the same wilderness that had once almost claimed his savior. By the time the fire at the livery was put out, it had done little real damage. A testament to its true purpose, the guards returned to the jail to find the window gaping open and the prisoner gone. The only things left behind were a few flecks of dark clay on the floor and the cut ropes on the cot. It was as if a ghost had come and gone. The news of Thomas Blackwell's escape hit Pinal Creek like a thunderclap. Silas Cain, roused from his bed, flew into a rage. To him, this wasn't just an escape. It was a public humiliation. He had held all the cards, and someone had stolen the pot from under his nose. Apache, he roared at Sheriff Brody in the middle of the street, his face purple with fury. It had to be Apache. No white man could have done it so cleanly. That boy has thrown in with the savages. He's sealed his fate. Cain's narrative was powerful. The escaped murderer had now allied himself with the territory's most feared enemy. He used the fear of Apache raids, a deep and primal terror in the settlers, to his advantage. He deputized another 20 of his own men, forming a formidable posse. Their mission was no longer to capture, but to kill. They would hunt Thomas Blackwell down and bring him back dead. Josiah heard the news from a sympathetic freight driver. His son was alive. He was free. A desperate, fragile hope bloomed in the old man's chest, but it was immediately followed by a wave of terror. Thomas was alone in the wilderness, hunted by a small army of men who wanted him dead. But something inside Josiah had shifted. The despair that had crippled him was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Cain had overplayed his hand. He had shown his true colors not just to Josiah, but to the entire town. And Josiah, with nothing left to lose, was no longer afraid. While Cain and his posse thundered into the mountains chasing a ghost, Josiah Blackwell rode into Pinal Creek. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He walked his horse down the center of the main street until he stood before the Gilded Cage saloon. A crowd of townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, began to gather. Josiah dismounted. He was just one old man, his face etched with grief, his clothes dusty and worn. But he stood with the unshakable certainty of a man who knows the truth. Jeb Rourke and a few of Cain's men, who had been left behind to guard the town, swaggered out onto the saloon's porch. "What do you want?" Old Man Rourke sneered. "Come to confess for your killer son." "My son is no killer," Josiah said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the tense silence. "And I've come to speak to the people of this town, the ones who aren't on Silas Cain's payroll." He turned his gaze to the assembled faces, the blacksmith, the store owner, the ranchers who had also felt Cain's squeeze. "You all know Cain. You know his greed. You've seen him swallow up smaller spreads. You've seen him bend the law to his will. Now he's tried to steal my land by framing my son for murder. That's a lie," Rourke shouted. "We all saw the evidence. You saw what Cain wanted you to see." Josiah countered, his voice rising with passion. "A planted knife and a dead man that my son had never met. And now, because his plan failed, he claims my boy has joined the Apache. He's using your fear to cover his own crime. He's counting on you to be blind. Sheep, I ask you, who benefits from my son's death? Who gets my ranch, my water? Me or the vulture who has been circling my home for a year?" The crowd murmured. Josiah's words rang with a truth that was hard to ignore. They had all seen Cain's ambition. They had all felt his shadow. Doubt, once planted, began to grow. It was at that moment that a ripple of movement was seen on the high ridge that overlooked the town from the west. At first it was just a few figures, then more. It was DeSoto High and his warriors. They were not charging. They were not yelling war cries. They simply sat upon their horses, a dozen silent, imposing figures outlined against the morning sky. They held rifles, but held them resting across their laps. It was not a declaration of war. It was a statement of presence, a silent testimony. With them were two other figures. One was a dazed-looking Thomas Blackwell, safe and unharmed. The other was the Apache scout, Goloko. DeSoto High gave a quiet command. Thomas and Goloko rode down the slope toward the town. The sight of Thomas alive and with the Apache sent a wave of shock through the crowd. Rourke and his men raised their rifles. "It's them! Kill them! Hold your fire!" Sheriff Brody yelled, stepping forward. He had been watching from his office, his conscience at war with his fear. Josiah's words and the strange, solemn appearance of the Apaches had tipped the scales. This was his chance for redemption. "Let's hear what they have to say." Thomas rode up to his father, dismounting and embracing him in a fierce, emotional hug. Then he turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff, this man," he said, gesturing to Goloko. He saw everything. He saw Cain's men murder that man Miller and plant my knife. Goloko spoke no English, but in the crowd was an old fur trader, Jacob Wells, who had spent years among the tribes and knew the Chiricahua dialect. As Goloko spoke in his guttural tongue, pointing and using stark hand gestures, Wells translated. He told of the cattle, the altered brand, the argument, the gunshot in the night. His testimony was simple, direct, and unshakable. He was a witness with no motive to lie. The tide of opinion in the crowd turned definitively. Angry murmurs rose against Cain. Rourke, seeing his power evaporate, panicked. "He's a lying savage! Don't listen to him!" he screamed, raising his rifle to shoot Goloko. He never fired. A single shot cracked from the ridge above. It was not aimed to kill. The bullet kicked up dust just in front of Rourke's feet. It was a warning shot delivered with breathtaking accuracy. Rourke froze his eyes wide with terror, staring up at the silent figures on the hill. Just then the sound of hoofbeats was heard from the other end of town. It was Silas Kane and his posse returning empty-handed and furious. He rode into the scene his foreman held at bay, the Blackwell boy, alive in Apache, telling a story to a rapt crowd, and he knew instantly that he had lost. Cornered and exposed, the vulture did what desperate animals do. He drew his pistol, aiming for Josiah. "This is all your fault, old man," he shrieked. But Sheriff Brody, finally choosing his side, was faster. He drew his own Colt and fired. The shot caught Kane in the shoulder, spinning him around. Kane, howling in pain and rage, tried to bring his gun back up. But another shot, this one from Thomas's pistol, struck him in the leg. Silas Kane collapsed in the street, his reign of terror over. On the ridge, DeSoto Hay watched the scene play out. He saw the old man and his son reunited. He saw the liar brought down. The balance was restored. The debt was paid. He looked across the distance and his eyes met Josiah's. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that single shared glance across the dusty divide, a lifetime of honor, gratitude, and mutual respect was communicated. Josiah raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture of profound acknowledgement. DeSoto Hay gave a single slow nod in return. Then he and his warriors turned their horses and melted back into the Superstition Mountains, disappearing as silently as they had come. As if on cue, the sky, which had been a brassy, cloudless bowl, began to darken. A cool wind swept through the town, carrying the scent of distant rain. The first heavy drops began to fall, kicking up puffs of dust in the street, washing the blood from the ground, and offering the promise of a new, cleaner start for the land, and for the men who had fought so hard to call it home. That is the story of Josiah Blackwell and DeSoto Hay, a tale etched into the harsh landscape of the American West. It's a powerful reminder that our lives are often interconnected in ways we can never predict. A single act of compassion offered without expectation of reward can ripple through time and return to us when we need it most. It proves that honor isn't a relic of the past. It's a living bond that can transcend language, culture, and even conflict. In a world that often felt lawless, the unwritten laws of debt and gratitude proved to be the most powerful of all. What do you think? What act of kindness, big or small, has shaped your life or the life of someone you know? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of the untamed West and the unbreakable bonds of honor moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a great historical tale, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more true stories from the forgotten pages of history. Thank you for listening.